Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. I think you're in for a treat. I'm a little prejudiced and partial, or whatever the right word is. Biased is probably it. That towards our speaker tonight. It's a great thing. He probably never had a chance in life not to be an academic. He was born when I was at OBU, and then he got to experience New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, and then he got to experience, while he was growing up, I was doing my doctoral work, and I think some of that bled over into him. Our son Justin is here tonight, and he's going to tell you more about himself. We're obviously very proud of him and the work that God's been doing in his life, and he's going to share about some important topics tonight. And if he runs out of time, that'll just be God letting us know he needs to come back and do more. So we're so enjoying our time with him. We really haven't had time for the last few years. We had those family weddings, but as far as just spending time together, this is a real treat for us. We're going to pray, and then he's going to come up and start sharing with us about God, evil, and that's probably, well, we'll see. Lord, thank you so much. Michelle and I are getting to enjoy having Justin here. Lord, we thank you for, God, the provision that you've made in his life to get where he is now, for the hard work he's done, for the things that you've taught him, and Lord, how he's pouring that into serving others and helping others grow to understand you and the world and life in relationship with you. And Lord, these big, hairy concepts that are often scary to people, Lord, I pray you'll speak through him, and by your Spirit, Lord, may you help us know what we need to. We're grateful for everyone here tonight, for every family, and for this church and this city. And Lord, may you guide us forward. We pray for rain, and Lord, we pray for revival in the land. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I almost said good morning. Not true. I am so excited to be here with you all this evening. I have heard lots of stories. My mom and I, we drove out to see my Beppa, my grandmother. So we had a little road trip before we got here. And all the way over, she was telling me story after story about all of you and just how much she loves you, how the laughs, how the hard time that some of you give her. And yeah, that's right. And it was so encouraging, so uplifting. So I've gotten to hear stories about many of you. I'm still having a little bit of a hard time placing faces with names, but we're working on it. And I just wanted to say, I feel like this trip is long past due, but I'm so grateful for all of you, how you have embraced my parents and my family, and the life that you have given them has been incredible for me to see from the outside. So I wanted to say thank you before I got started here. Tonight, I'm going to be, the title of this talk, anyways, is God, Evil, and Free Will. As my father has already hinted, this may be slightly misleading. But let's take a look at the agenda here. Oh no, my clicker powers, they're not working. That's okay. I'll just, is it working? Okay. Magic, perfect. All right. So here's what we're going to try to do this evening. We're going to start off, because I, like so many human beings, am a little bit selfish. We're going to start out by talking about me. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about arguments and the nature of logic. Then we're going to talk about a contingency argument for God's existence. I think this was the most popular vote when my dad gave you all the options on things that I could potentially talk about. This is an example of a traditional argument to the conclusion that God exists. So we're going to be taking a look at that this evening. After that, we're going to be talking about an epistemological response to the problem of evil. Epistemological is just a big word that has to do with knowledge. And then we are not actually, I guess I'll go ahead and break the bad news to you now. I don't think we're going to have time to get to the free will stuff. It was a little overambitious. I was really confident when I was first talking to my dad about what all I might be able to achieve here. I was like, yeah, I feel like I could do quite a few things. As I started plotting out more and more, I was humbled and realized, maybe not. So I apologize. First impression here, and I'm already breaking promises to all of you. Whatever goodwill I may have had, it's just I'm already cashing it in. So if you were only here to hear about free will, I'm willing to full refund. That's what I'll say. And maybe, if things go well, maybe my parents will invite me back again someday. And if I do come back, we will talk a lot about free will then. Well, hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A session as well. We'll see. All right, so that's the agenda. Let's talk about who I am. I was really hoping this could be like a dramatic reveal here. Like, oh, I'm your pastor's son, surprise. But I've been told by many of you that there's something of a family resemblance there. That was giving me away a little bit. So I'll add on to that. I'm also your pastor's wife's son. I don't like to brag, but it took both of them to raise me. So, put that out there. I'm also a husband of 2 years. This is me with my mom. And we here on Sunday. Super excited about that. I think she's going to be talking with the youth a little bit, so stay tuned for that. Absolutely adore her. She makes me so much better than I would be on my own. A little bit more boring. I'm also currently a student at the University of Notre Dame. I'm pursuing a PhD in philosophy. I do a thing called metaphysics, which you might think means that I could in some way operate on you. That is false. I'm a metaphysician, but as the great movie Treasure Planet says, I am the sort of doctor who doesn't do anybody any good. The specifics of what I do work on personal identity and life narratives. So thinking about questions like, what does it mean to be a person? What does it take for you to survive? As Christians, we believe God has promised us that He is going to raise us from the dead. I think it's a really interesting question to think about. What exactly does that mean? What exactly would that require? Maybe we can't give a good answer to that in this life, but it's at least interesting to think about. I also think about stuff related to personality and who we are, how our stories that we tell about ourselves shape our character. So you might think about a dramatic life event that someone goes through, and their loved ones say things like, oh, they're not the same person anymore. I find that a really interesting phrase or expression, and I do some research in trying to think about a little bit more about what people could be getting at when they say things like that. So that's my boring job or whatever. In my dad's quest to make me an oversized mini-me of himself, he succeeded on this front. I too am a giant Lord of the Rings nerd. He failed on the next point. When I first got into football, Vinny Testaverde was the quarterback for the Cowboys, and they were just not very exciting to watch. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna look elsewhere. Oh man, savage! They're ripping you apart of it. Lastly, and most importantly here, I am a follower of Jesus. I'm going to be sharing a lot of information over the course of this evening, and I recognize at the outset here that for some of you, this may not be your cup of tea. And I just want to say that is perfectly okay. I'm really glad you're here. Feel free to hang out and just glean what you can as you go along. But if at some point you're like, I need to tap out, hop on Candy Crush for a minute or something, that's fine by me. Some of you as well are going to love this stuff. You're going to wish that we were going even deeper into the deep end of the pool than we're actually going to do tonight. And I'm really glad that you're here as well. Some of you are just along for the ride, and you know what? That's great. We're just chilling somewhere in the middle. But I want to bring this up here and mention it as just it may be hard to see at certain points along the way, but all of it really is centered and directed. I'm going to be sharing some of my own thoughts, some thoughts from other faithful Christians who are trying to really figure out what it means to love God with all your mind. So that's where this stuff is coming from this evening. All right, I think those are our preliminaries. Let's go ahead and jump into some philosophy. Welcome to Philo 101, everybody. Class is now in session. We're going to talk about the anatomy of argument to kick things off. This was not something that I originally had on the schedule, but as I was plotting, as I was thinking it out, I was like, Dad, I really feel like it would be helpful if we spent some time just talking a little bit about what an argument actually is and giving people tools to evaluate arguments more carefully. So, the first question we have here, what is an argument? Typically, in day-to-day speech, when we throw the word argument around, we mean something like, there was a heated discussion between person A and person B. They disagree. That's what we typically mean by arguments in real life. In philosophy, that's not what we mean. We mean something different. So what are we talking about? In philosophy, an argument is a collection of claims that are purportedly related in a special kind of way. I realize that is initially vague. I'm going to elaborate on it a little bit. Let's start off. What's a claim? Well, you're familiar with these. You say many of them every day, all the time. A great deal of your sentences are claims. Any sentence that can be evaluated by saying it's true or it's false counts as a claim. So some sentences that you say are not claims. For example, if you ask, "Where's the dog?" a question is not a claim. An imperative statement like, "Go to the store," that's not a claim. But sentences like these: "He was driving a silver car with no plates." "Stealing is wrong." "Jupiter has 79 moons." These are all examples of sentences that we can look at and we can ask, is this true or is this false? Claims are the body of argumentation. They're what all of our arguments are built out of. So that leads us to ask, what's the special relationship that's supposed to hold between claims, at which point we know we have an argument? And for that, I'm going to have to take you on a little tiny journey and talk about two different types of claims. So, when we are building an argument, we have two types of claims. On the one hand, we have premises, and on the other, we have a conclusion. The conclusion is the target. That's what you're trying to get to. All of your argumentation is oriented towards, is aimed at establishing some particular thing as true. And to arrive at that destination, you need premises. So premises are the tools that you're going to build with, and you're going to use them to reach a conclusion, saying, hey, this thing that we didn't previously know, we have good evidence to believe that it's true. Now, the special relationship that arguments use is the relationship, it's the following relationship. In order for us to have a good argument, in order for us to have a good and interesting argument, we need it to be the case that we can't imagine a situation in which all of the premises that we've used to build our argument are true, but the conclusion is false. The idea is we're going to start with premises that people are inclined to accept. We're going to argue, hey, these things are true, and guess what? Once we've accepted all of these things as true, we have to accept this other thing, and it's our conclusion. So that's the relationship that we're trying to establish between premises and a conclusion in order to have a good argument. When an argument has this feature, the technical piece of jargon is we say it's valid. Sometimes in day-to-day speech, we use the word valid. We'll throw it around. You might be in an argument with somebody, and you might come to a point where you're like, I'm done arguing or something. And you tell them, like, okay, your point's valid or something like that. We say that. In philosophy, validity does not apply to singular points. It applies to arguments as wholes. It says, hey, this argument has a particular kind of shape or particular structure or form that we like. It gets a thumbs up. What's that shape? It's having this feature where we tried to make all of the premises true, and we discovered that when we made all the premises true, we ended up with a true conclusion. Let's talk about an example of this. We're going to compare and contrast a genuine argument with something that masquerades as an argument that a lot of people engage in day-to-day life, but is not really an argument. And to do that, we're going to use a particular example. So my wife, she is an animal lover, and she greatly enjoys having animals in her life. We do not currently own an animal. And so I thought it would be fun to use as a little case to walk you all through what I'm talking about here. I thought we could imagine a scenario in which my wife is trying to convince me that we need to adopt a shelter dog. So this is the conclusion that she's going to try to establish in our hypothetical scenario. When I told her I was developing these slides, she did not necessarily appreciate that I was using her as an example. And she told me, she was like, you know what you should have done? You should have had your dad be trying to convince us that it was time to give him a grandchild. That should have been the example that you went with. And I was like, oh, this is brilliant. Like, that was so good. But I was lazy and didn't want to rewrite all the slides. So as we're going along, if you want to imagine that alternative case, you are free to do so. But anyway, this is Kayla's conclusion. Kayla's going to try to make an argument for the conclusion we should adopt a shelter dog. There are two ways that she might try to do this. Option one, she could do what we might call the shotgun or the grab bag approach, which is where you just chuck a whole bunch of reasons at somebody to do something and try to win them over by quantity. Or option two, you can provide an argument. So let's look at this. What does the grab bag sort of approach look like? What might Kayla say if she was trying to use a grab bag approach to win me over to get us a dog? Well, she might say something like, hey, look, Justin, all of our friends have adopted dogs lately. She might say, we need motivation to get outside more often, which is true, we do. She might say, if we don't adopt a shelter dog, then the shelter's probably going to put a dog to sleep. And it's really sad. We don't want that to happen. She might say, if we don't adopt a shelter dog, we're probably going to end up buying a dog from a puppy farm. She might say, Justin, you like dogs more than cats, right? And she might say, you know, it'd be less lonely around the house when one of us is busy if we had a pet. These are all things that she might say to me to try to convince me that we should get a dog. Well, the question I want to ask all of you is how these claims work together. We know that in building an argument, you need to develop a set of claims that have a special relationship that hold together in a particular kind of way. My question to all of you is, how do these claims do that? And I won't keep you in suspense. The answer is that they don't. All of these claims, they're all oriented towards this conclusion: we should adopt a shelter dog, but they all work in isolation from each other. They're not talking to each other in any sort of interesting way. In fact, it's not even clear that they're really leading perfectly to the conclusion. Remember, in order for an argument to be valid, we need it to be the case that you can't make the premise true while the conclusion is false. So let's consider a case. Let's say, let's look at I'm bored. I'm bored. It's not related to any of the other claims. So if it's going to be an argument for the conclusion, it has to do, all of its work has to be done in isolation. It by itself has to get me to the conclusion we should adopt a shelter dog. Let's imagine. Suppose I am in fact bored. Suppose that's true. Does it automatically follow that we should go adopt a shelter dog? Is it the case that every bored person ever needs to go running to the shelter and get a dog? You might think that's true. If you do, you are a passionate animal lover, and I respect it. But it's not true. None of these claims in isolation are sufficient to get you to the conclusion. Now, you might be thinking as you go along, like, oh, but this is, I kind of felt the tug. Like, I felt some motivation as I was listening to these claims towards the conclusion that you guys should go buy a shelter dog. What's going on there? Well, the truth is that your brain is a really remarkable thing, and on a subconscious level, often it's supplying missing premises to establish these conclusions. Things are going unsaid that your brain is just supplying in the background to help get to the destination if you're finding these things persuasive. It's really useful that our brains do this. It diminishes the amount of cognitive workload that we have to do consciously, which is good. But it's also really dangerous because often the most controversial premises of an argument are the ones that go unsaid. So, we want to look at an alternative way of doing things. What does it look like if Kayla actually gives me an argument? So suppose instead of saying those other things, she tells me the following. She says, look, I know you're going to cave. We're either going to adopt a shelter dog or we're going to buy a dog from a puppy farm. Moreover, she adds, in our situation, it's better to adopt a shelter dog than to buy a dog from a puppy farm. And also, This is a little background principle that I know you, Justin, accept. When faced with an either-or choice, and one option is clearly better than the other option, you should choose the better option. Now, let's consider, how do these claims work together? Really well, as it turns out. Each of these highlighted sections here is an instance in which we have our premises of our argument talking to each other. So, let's just walk through them a little bit slowly. Premise 3 is really interesting, even though you might think it's kind of obvious, because it gives us a general rule that we can apply in a lot of different situations. It tells us, hey, when you're in an either-or situation, and so I can say, all right, stop. Am I in an either-or situation? Look at premise 1. Sure enough, there we go. We're either going to adopt a shelter dog or we're going to buy a dog from a puppy farm. So check, we've got that part. That's the first part of 3. Do we meet the second part of 3? One option is better than the other. Oh, look at premise 2. It says it's better to do one thing than it is to do the other thing. So we meet both of these criteria for the first part of 3. What does the last part of 3 say? It says, hey, there's something we should do. We should choose the better option. Which one's the better option? I go back, I look at premise 2. Oh yeah, it's to adopt a shelter dog. Therefore, we should adopt a shelter dog. So, is Kayla's argument valid? Indeed it is. It gets a little Facebook-like. Yeah. Question, does this just mean I'm getting a dog now? Do I have to go home and adopt a dog? Well, not so fast. In order for an argument to be compelling, it isn't enough for its premises to be related to its conclusion in a valid way. The argument also has to have true premises. So there are 2 ingredients when we're trying to develop a really good argument. It needs to have a valid form. That's the thing that we've been talking about. But we also need to note that the claims that the premises are advancing are true. If either of these are missing, then our argument isn't sound. But if they're both there, then the argument is sound. And, importantly, if you accept that an argument is sound, you are committed to its conclusion. You are saying, yes, this conclusion is true. This is an analogy that I find helpful sometimes. The form of an argument, whether it's valid or not, that's kind of like the blueprint. That's saying, hey, does this structure of this thing that we've built, is it viable? Will it hold up? It doesn't matter if you've got the best building materials in the world if your blueprint is drawn in crayon by a 4-year-old. It's not going to hold up. It's not going to stand the test of time. Similarly, even if you've got a perfect blueprint, if you're trying to build your house out of ramen noodles, popsicle sticks, jelly beans, what have you, it's still not going to hold up. You need both components if you're going to have a good house. Similarly, you need both components if you're going to have a sound argument. So with that in mind, let's return to Kayla's argument here and let's take a closer look at the premises. And I'm just going to speak for myself here. Thinking about, all right, I'm going to look at them. What do I think here? Premise 3, premise 2, I buy both of those. Premise 2, maybe I think that's true because, shelter dog is cheaper than a puppy dog or a puppy from a puppy farm. Want to save some money, so yeah, I buy 2. 3 just seems really like it makes sense to me, so I buy that. But what about 1? Am I going to accept it? No. Because, I say to Kayla, we are strong, and we have free will, and we can make choices. We're not locked in. We don't have to either adopt a shelter dog or buy a dog from a puppy farm. We could do neither. And so this argument fails. It's a very sad day for the puppy. I know. I'm a monster. Absolutely. Once again, I would like to say that this was hypothetical. What's the upshot here? If somebody gives you an argument and you don't want to accept it, you look at that conclusion, you're like, I don't like that very much. Then you have 2 moves available to you. You can either try to say, look, that conclusion doesn't actually follow from those premises, or you can say, one of these premises, or more, are false. Those are the 2 moves that you can make. And the same goes for someone who argues against something that you say. If you advance an argument and someone's trying to object to you, those are also the only two moves that they can make. Sometimes people will try to object, or they'll say like, oh, I don't like your argument. Let me give you a totally different argument that has a different conclusion, and they're changing the subject on you. That's cheating. You've already done a lot of work. You went through all this effort to provide them with an argument. They need to take that seriously, because if your argument is sound, if it's got valid form and true premises, then the conclusion is true. So if they don't deal with your argument, they're not really philosophically engaging with you. This is going to be particularly relevant with the examples that we're going to be looking at. So we're just about to dive into an argument about God's existence, and then we're going to talk about the problem of evil. Sometimes, if you're engaged in discussion with, for example, someone who disagrees with you on these issues, and you say like, oh, hey, let me give you this argument for God's existence. Boom, premises, conclusion, it's all valid. Are the premises true? They look plausible. If someone responds by saying, well, like, oh, what about the problem of evil? They're changing the subject. They're shifting. And maybe that's okay, but register that. Realize, like, oh, they're shifting the terrain here. I put this effort forward, and now they're shifting the ground of the debate. Sneaky. All right. So, that was part one. How are we feeling, everybody? Are we doing okay? All right, good, good. Let's go ahead and talk about an argument from contingency. What is this argument? What is this argument from contingency? Well, it's in a family of arguments called cosmological arguments for God's existence. Cosmological arguments, they just start with some part of our observed reality. For example, maybe the nature of causality, maybe the nature of dependence. And they try to say, hey, we can look at the world, and in looking at the world, we get some kind of evidence for thinking that there's a creator, that there's a necessary being, that there's some kind of being with infinite power, something along those lines. This particular argument, we're going to be talking about the foundations of everything. Sounds very exciting, I know. It comes in two stages, this particular argument. Each of the two stages has a different goal in mind of what it's trying to establish. The first stage, the goal here is to show that there is some kind of necessary reality. I'll talk about what the difference between a necessary reality and a contingent reality is in a moment. Maybe that sounds you might have a sense of it already from just thinking about the meaning of those words. But we'll talk about it. And then in stage two, after you've argued, hey, look, we have good reason to think that there's some necessary being out there. Well, stage two goes on to say, moreover, when we think about the characteristics of this necessary being, we start to notice that they're kind of godlike. Some of these attributes that make sense to posit that this necessary being has are already the things that people were saying that God has. Kind of cool. This argument, I just want to say up front that sometimes I bring this up because some of my students, like I'll be teaching a class with some students, and we'll be talking about arguments for God's existence, and they'll say, I believe this argument's sound. It seems to lead to the conclusion that there's a necessary being, so I do think that there is a necessary being, and I believe that this being is all-powerful, and I believe that this being is personal, but this argument didn't prove to me that this being was all good, so I don't believe it's God. It's something else. And they're just like, child, you're being so difficult. Appreciate what an argument can do. If we have an argument that tells us, hey, there's a necessary reality, that's super cool. If it doesn't get us all the way to the conclusion, oh, and by the way, this being is a triune God who sent his son to be incarnate 2,000 years ago, that's okay. This argument wasn't even trying to do that. It was just trying to get the foot in the door for the conversation. Oh yeah, maybe there is a God after all. So, even if it doesn't establish everything that we believe, everything that's been revealed about God from Scripture, it can still provide powerful reasons in line with those further beliefs that we have from Revelation. Occasionally, as we're going along here, you'll see a book on the side. I threw these up just to show kind of some resources that I used in developing this presentation. I don't know that these would necessarily be recommended reads, but I thought, hey, here in particular, I'm pulling a lot from this guy, Joshua Rasmussen. He's really cool. I'll throw up a link to his YouTube or something, I think, at the end of this. I forget. All right, so let's talk about stage one of this argument, arguing to the conclusion that there is a necessary reality. Why should we think that there's a necessary reality? Well, let's start out with a little puzzle. When we look at the world in our everyday experience, and maybe even beyond that in our scientific investigations, we look at motorcycles, we look at mountains, we look at motorcycles. I said motorcycles twice, I meant molecules the first time. We look at these different realities, and we notice this common feature that they have. They are all in different ways, maybe causally, maybe compositionally, maybe nomenologically, that means just laws. In these various ways, they're dependent things. In order for me to have a chair, there needs to be wood or metal or some kind of material for me to build the chair out of. There also needs to be some kind of craftsman. There are all these different ways in which when we look at the realities around us, we see they are dependent upon other things to be here at all. And part of how we know that, when we think about other things and even when we think about ourselves, is that their existence is not guaranteed. These are things that could be gone. That's what we mean when we use the word contingent. Contingency means anything that can fail to exist. So, for example, there was a time before you were born. There was a time when you weren't here. So that means that you are a contingent being. You could fail to exist. And the same goes for each of these things. They're all composed of parts. They're all dependent upon certain kinds of natural forces working upon them. They have all come into existence, and it seems like they could go out of existence. So it seems as though when we look at our world, it looks like everything comes from something else, that there's this kind of dependence that's true of everything in our experience. So that's one side of the puzzle. On the other hand, and this is going to be a little bit philosophical here, but we know that everything real is part of reality. That may sound kind of silly, but if you think about, okay, what would it be for something to not be real? Well, unreal, non-existent. Non-existent, you couldn't be part of reality if you weren't existent. So everything real has to be part of reality. So there's nothing prior to reality as a whole. There's nothing separate, existing independent of the sum total of reality. Why does that matter? Because we've already been thinking, it looks like everything depends upon something else. But if there's nothing prior to all of reality, then what does all of reality depend upon? It seems like there has to be at least some part of reality that doesn't depend upon anything else for its existence. That's just there. So we have these conflicting intuitions. Intuition A tells us, hey, everything depends upon something prior to exist. And intuition B tells us something does not depend upon anything else to exist. And this is a problem because these two claims, they contradict each other. They can't both be true, it seems. So what do? We're in a pickle. How do we get out of it? The solution that I would like to suggest, that others have suggested, is that it seems to make sense to think of two different layers of reality. On the one hand, we have a contingent layer of reality, and everything that has the potential to fail to exist falls in this category. This is what intuition A applies to. These are the things that we're interacting with in our experience, the things that break apart, the things that can be rebuilt, the contingent layer. But then it seems like we also need a non-contingent layer of reality, something that doesn't depend upon anything else in order to be here. Something that cannot fail to exist. Whatever intuition B applies to, it's this thing. It's in this category. So that's the way we try to solve this. We have these apparently contradictory intuitions. We say, okay, there must be different parts of the world that these intuitions are tracking. And that gives us the contingency argument stage 1. Let's take a look at this. So, for any contingent thing or things, there is some prior condition that allows for that thing's or things, plural's, existence. So, for example, fundamental particles are a precondition. I didn't realize you all had pews when I wrote this, so, the pew that you're sitting in. And then this should say 2. I think the formatting got a little messed up here, but this is premise 2 of the argument. If there is a prior condition for all contingent things together, so the whole basket, the whole world, that prior condition cannot itself be contingent. Then the conclusion, there's something that is non-contingent, i.e., there's something that cannot not exist. Negations are funky, but this translates into there's some necessary reality. There's something that can't fail to exist. Is this argument valid? Well, let's look at how it works together. A really important part of it in premise 1 is what's happening in parentheses here. Because it tells us, hey, look, for any group of contingent things, there's going to be a prior condition upon which they depend. So, what's the biggest group of contingent things that we can think of? It's all of them. And we're saying, just like for your chair that requires a precondition, the whole basket of contingent things needs some kind of prior condition in order to be here at all. If that's true, then we get this, hey, this thing can't be among the contingent things. It has to be something different. What's the opposite of a contingent thing? It's a necessary thing. And I basically forgot that I had this little pictures here that said exactly what I just said to you, so we're going to skip through them. But it's this reality, it's this commitment to this belief that, hey, contingent things, they have explanations for why they're here. We can look at, if we come across a chair in the middle of the wilderness, and you're driven to ask, like, why is there a chair here? The answer, oh, it just popped into existence, generally not a compelling answer. You crave more. You want a deeper explanation than that. And when we apply that same craving to the whole shebang, we're driven to posit that there's some non-contingent thing upon which all the contingent stuff depends. Hey, it's valid. Sweet. So I think it has true premises. Well, we kind of talked about this a little bit already. Here's premise 1 once again. It seems like when we pick any particular contingent thing, we have these 3 options. We can say there's no prior condition for it. We can say it's its own prior condition. Or we can say there's a prior condition that's outside of it. We've already ruled out option 1. If we bought into the idea that things just pop into existence willy-nilly without prior conditions, then it seems like we're committed to a universe that's fundamentally absurd and unknowable. So sometimes you'll hear Christians being charged as unreasonable, not caring about science, not caring about explanation. This is an instance in which Christians, in an argument for God's existence, are emphatically taking a stand on the opposite direction, saying, no, we believe that the world is intelligible. We believe that it was designed with us in mind to explore and to know. And so we're committed to the idea that the universe is not fundamentally absurd. What about these other 2 options? Well, generally, as much fun as Willie Nelson's I'm My Own Grandpa is as a song, we realize that you can't actually be your own grandpa because that would require you to pre-exist yourself. And if you're pre-existing yourself, then you're already there, so you're not pre-existing yourself. It's one of those moments where you get a contradiction. It just doesn't work. Sometimes people feel like they're a big shot, that they're a big deal, but none of us are that big of a deal. None of us can bootstrap our own existence. None of us can bring ourselves into being. So it seems as though we are driven to this conclusion that for the chair, there's a prior condition that's outside of it. And then we just have this question, is what's true of the chair true for every contingent thing? And it certainly seems like it is. But I'll invite you to test it. See if you can come up with something that's clearly contingent, that clearly could fail to exist. And something that can either meet one of these two other options, that could pop into being from nowhere, or be its own prior condition. There are some objections that people have proposed to try to say, like, oh, hey, what about this? I think they all fail, but I don't want to dwell on that too long now. Maybe we can come back to it in Q&A. One example that you'll hear has to do with quantum mechanics, and particularly the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. But it doesn't work here. It's a misunderstanding of the theory to try to say that it works. So I'll just throw that out because sometimes people get cheeky and try to say that. So it looks like premise 1 is good. What about premise 2? If there's a prior condition for all contingent things, that prior condition cannot itself be contingent. Well, here we have the same I'm my own grandpa problem. Suppose somebody wanted to deny the premise. That person has to say that it's possible for some contingent thing, I just named it Greg here, so we could talk about Greg, to be the prior condition for all contingent things. But since Greg itself is a contingent thing, Greg has to be the prior condition for Greg. So Greg has to pre-exist Greg, but if Greg pre-exists Greg, then Greg doesn't pre-exist Greg, so it doesn't work. Greg is not the answer. You heard it here first. This will not work. All right, so it looks like premise 1 was true, premise 2 was true, and together they entail that there is some necessary reality. We've got the valid form, we've got the true premises. Ping! It looks like we've got the conclusion, there's a necessary reality. Pretty nifty. Let's move on to stage 2. Remember, stage 2 is where we take this established claim. Hey, look, we argued to the claim that there's a necessary reality out there. Now we get to ask, what's that reality like? What is this thing that we've argued for? Can we know anything else about it? Or do we just have to call it quits there? Joshua Rasmussen, who I mentioned already, he takes this argument, he goes really ambitious with it. He tries to argue that once we've established that there's a necessary reality, we can demonstrate that this reality is also all-knowing, all-powerful, that it's personal, that it's loving. So he thinks you can get a lot out of this claim. I am not going to go quite as thorough as that tonight. I was worried about time. So we're going to start. I'm going to start the ball in motion here so you can get a sense of how this sort of argument goes. So, what is this necessary reality like? Well, let's think for a moment about what it gives rise to. What has this necessary reality produced? Well, look around. One thing that it's produced is minds. It's also produced matter, morality, and mathematics. That's quite the spread. It's a lot of M words. I'm a pastor's son. I like alliteration. There's a lot of diversity here. And it looks as though, given this diversity of contingent things, that whatever this necessary reality is, that it's going to need significant power in order to be the prior condition for these things. If it didn't have any power, then it wouldn't be able to bring anything about. It's brought about a bunch of stuff. So it seems like that option is out. But now we have to ask the question, how much power does it have? We've got these 3 options. Necessary reality has no power. I already said that doesn't seem to be an option because we're here. Option 2, necessary reality has limited power. Or option 3, it has limitless power, i.e., it is omnipotent. Omnipotent, that's how we say that word, or omnipotent. It has all the power. We've already ruled that one out. What about these other 2? Let's think about the chair again. This is not just a weird, I want to say as a side note, philosophers, we think about chairs a lot. It's not just me. I don't have a particular problem. Well, let's think about a single chair. It takes a certain amount of power to bring that chair into being. But we can imagine, in addition to that first chair, you can imagine a second chair next to it. And it's going to take even more power to bring about 2 chairs than it is to bring about 1 chair. And once we've got the 2 chairs, we can imagine a third chair. And that's going to require even more power. And boom, before you know it, we just got like 1 billion chairs up in here. And it's going to take even more power to get even more chairs. But now this is interesting because it seems as though when we're just imagining that there's no limit to the number of chairs that could exist. Pick a number, 500 billion and 27. It seems as though there could be a 500 billion and 28th chair. And if that's true, then it seems as though there must be a being that has enough power to genuinely bring about that 528th chair. So this sort of thought, as silly as it might seem, thinking about chairs, you could actually do it with anything, any contingent thing, you can plug it in. It gives you this argument. We start out with this claim, hey, we've ruled out the possibility that necessary reality has no power, so now we know it either has limited power or limitless power. But now, premise 2, we know that there's no limit to the number of contingent beings that could exist. Why think that? Well, we just imagined an infinite number of chairs, an endless sequence where we just added more and more material stuff into the picture. But now, premise 3, if necessary reality has limited power, then surprise, actually, as it turns out, there would be a limit to the number of contingent things that could exist. If the necessary being has limited rather than limitless power, then there is some number. We don't know what it is. But there's some point at which it turns out like, oh, actually, there could only be 500,000,084 chairs. That's the limit. That's all the necessary being can do. Can't do anything more. But that seems really arbitrary. It seems like there's no good reason to say that it would be limited. Why can't the necessary being bring out another chair? Why can't it do one more? It doesn't seem like there's a good justification for that. So it seems more plausible to think that this necessary reality does not have limited power, that there's no arbitrary amount of chairs that's the max number that this necessary being could bring into a being. But if that's true, then we've ruled out the option that it has limited power, and the only other possibility is that it has limitless power, i.e., it's omnipotent. The argument passes the validity test, or at least it arguably does. Some people might try to dispute that, but we don't have to get into the weeds tonight. And then the question is, are its premises true? And here again, I would submit, yes, indeed, they are in fact true. So it looks as though we have a case that ends with the conclusion, not only is there a necessary being, but this necessary being has limitless power. Pretty awesome. Here we are. Now the question is, all right, we've got this necessary reality. We've shown that it has limitless power. Where do we go from there? Well, we have a lot of options, as it turns out, but here's my favorite option. It seems as though we've established, okay, there's a necessary reality, and it's got limitless power, but now we want to ask, given that there are contingent things, given that you and I could go out of existence, it seems like the best explanation for why we're here at all is that this necessary, limitless powered being has volition, that it has a will, and it can choose what to bring into being. If it didn't have a will, if it was just churning stuff out like a machine, then it would seem as though actually whatever exists has to exist, because the machine is just operating. It's just doing what its program tells it to do. It's just generating outputs. But something with a will, by contrast, gets to decide what it does. So it looks as though there's good reason to think, from the very fact that you and I are here, that there's some necessary, powerful being that has a will, i.e., is a person, that's responsible for our being here at all. Pretty sweet. That's all I wanted to cover for this argument this evening. But if you're interested, if you want to learn more, one thing I wanted to recommend, this is Joshua Rasmussen's website. He has a little survey that you can go on where you fill it out, and you basically can he asks you a series of questions, and you get to answer whatever way you want, and he builds from your answers as you're filling them in. He shows how you're committed to the belief that there is a necessary being. It's pretty neat. Additionally, you can look up Capturing Christianity, which is a YouTube page, and search for the argument from contingency, and you'll get some extended discussions about the nature of the argument there. If you're interested in learning more about the argument. If you're done, I perfectly understand, and we'll move on. Good deal. Any questions here? How we doing? All right, cool. Let's go ahead and move on. This is the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about this evening, the problem of gratuitous suffering. So we've just looked at an argument that seems to give us really powerful evidence that God does exist. I wanted to close by looking at the most commonly cited argument against the claim that God exists. And it has to do with the problem of evil. It's a family of arguments. And often when people talk about the problem of evil, they'll begin by telling a story, some kind of really heartbreaking story about a tragedy that either happened to them or someone they know or someone out in the world. I don't really feel the need to do that this evening because my parents do life with all of you. And so I am aware that for many of you, the problem of evil is something that you are all too familiar with, that it is something that you have experienced firsthand, either recently, something that you're currently going through, or in your past. If you don't find yourself in that boat this evening, then I would just say, hey, turn on the news, and you might see something about a war in Ukraine and civilians being shot and raped, or racially motivated killings, or the fire that is consuming your state, and you will have good reasons to believe that there's evil. And we feel that. It's confusing to us because it doesn't seem to line up with this claim that God loves and cares about us. And so it naturally raises questions for the believer. What's going on here? How can God be all good and want what's best for me, and yet my life look like this? So that's what we're going to talk about to close things out here. Just a little bit more background on the argument. The goal of this particular argument, remember, this is an argument against God's existence. It wants to show that either the mere existence of evil or at least the amounts and kinds of evil that we experience in this world are incompatible with the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God. There are different dimensions to this problem, and those different dimensions have to be dealt with differently. So, for instance, there's an emotional element to this problem. And while our hearts and our brains are connected, or all our hearts and our minds are connected, there's an extent to which no amount of argumentation is going to solve things for someone who is just genuinely in a place of grief. And that's okay. They work together, they can help out, but one of my favorite thinkers, C.S. Lewis, he wrote a little book when his wife died. It's called The Grief Observed. And he talks about, he was a brilliant intellectual, had so many friends who were just really committed, thoughtful believers. And when his wife died, they came and visited him, and they gave him all of these reasons, all of these thoughts, all of these explanations. And there's this really powerful passage in this little book where he's journaling about his experience, and he says, I just wish they would shut up. But I don't want them to go away. And that's the reality of the emotional problem of evil. It's not always something that needs an answer right then in that moment. It's something to be prayed over, wrestled with God, and for us to come along, our fellow believers, and comfort them in that time and not try to explain it all. There's also an evidential dimension to this problem, and it just has to do with this reality that it's hard for us to really get a bead on what's ultimately for our good and ultimately for our bad sometimes. There are times when you undergo something and it is painful and it is hard and you hate it. But years later, when you're looking in the rearview mirror of your life, you see how that event made you who you are and you're really grateful for it. So that makes this tricky. We can't always tell in the moment how to evaluate what's happening to us. And finally, there's an intellectual dimension, which is where we actually engage with argumentation. When we look at the claims, people who try to argue like, look, this is evidence that God doesn't exist, when we as Christians try to respond to that. And that's this final part. These are all interrelated, but there are distinct elements, and they do deserve to be treated differently, distinctly to some extent. Let's start off. This is the logical problem of evil. In the 20th century, especially the early part of the 20th century, this was, in many intellectual circles, considered a decisive argument that showed that you could not rationally be a theist, or like there was really powerful evidence that theism was not a justified belief. It started out with this claim, look, if God is all good and all powerful, there will be no evil. And the idea behind it is just this thought, like, hey, if God is all good and all powerful, he's going to have the ability to get rid of any evil, and he's going to have the desire to get rid of any evil. If he's got the ability and the desire, then he's going to do it. But premise 2, subtly disguised as premise 1, part 2, there is, in fact, evil. These two claims taken together logically entail that there's no good, all powerful being, i.e. the God that we believe in does not exist. Is this argument valid? Yes. It checks the box. So that raises the question, which premise should we as Christians reject here? Well, as should be clear from how I opened this particular part of the talk, I think it is pretty much uncontroversial for Christians that there is, in fact, evil. There are some Eastern religions that deny the existence of evil, that say suffering is an illusion. We are not members of that religion, or one of those religions. We believe clearly, though, the evidence of evil is all around us. So that means we need to look at this other premise, that if God is all good and all powerful, then there will be no evil. How do we respond to that? Well, the guy who really turned the tides on this was Al Plantinga, a former Notre Dame professor, sadly now retired, but he's my academic grandpa, so I think he's pretty cool. He wrote this book called God, Freedom, and Evil, and it was designed in large part to refute this premise and say, no, actually, it could be the case that an all-good and all-powerful God would still allow the existence of evil. Why might you think that? Well, you might think that if you think God has some really good reasons to allow the existence of certain types of evil. If there are certain goods in this world that you might not be able to get without the risk of evil. What might they be? Well, you might be familiar with some of these answers now. It looks as though it's possible that certain goods, such as creaturely freedom or soul-making, cannot be realized apart from evil. Free will, hopefully that makes sense. Plantinga argued that it's possible that we are what he calls transworld depraved, which just means sinner's going to sin. You put us in a world, human beings are going to mess it up. We have free will, and free will comes with this tendency, this proclivity towards evil, he thinks. Or he at least suggests as a possibility in that book. Another option, people talk about soul-making, and it's this idea that we are refined through our suffering, that we're made better by undergoing trials. If you've ever, for example, had an argument with your spouse, I don't know if that's ever happened to any of you, but if it has, and then on the other side of it, you've reconciled, you've had the opportunity to experience forgiveness, and you find, oh, actually, we're closer for having gone through this, I'm being refined as a person through this, then you may have experienced something like soul-making. These are this idea that, hey, there are these really powerful goods that we experience as a result of there being certain kinds of evils in the world. So it looks as though, and today it's pretty much uncontroversial in the philosophy world, premise 1 is bogus, and the argument fails. But the reality of evil is still all around us. And so, philosophers who are opposed to theism have tried to nuance the argument. They've tried to complicate matters further. Say like, oh no, there are additional problems here that we haven't fully addressed yet. What does that look like? Well, for example, a guy named William Rowe has advanced what he calls the problem of gratuitous evil. And premise 1 of the problem of gratuitous evil is that, hey, if God is all good and all powerful, then there are not going to be any gratuitous evils out there. What's a gratuitous evil? Well, it's any evil that exists. It's this idea that there are evils out there that are not connected in any sort of way to any kind of greater good. They're not a result of human free will. They're not making anybody better because they've happened. They're just there. And, he argued, there are in fact gratuitous evils. An example that he provides is a fawn dying in a forest fire. He says, look, not obvious that that was the result of any free choice if we assume that the fire is a natural disaster, something like a lightning strike. And it's not as though the fawn is made better through this process, it just dies. So he wanted to say the fawn burning is an example of a gratuitous evil in our world. If you take these two premises together, you get the conclusion that God is not all good and all powerful, i.e., there is no God. So, more complicated version of the problem also deserves a serious response. And unfortunately, there are several interesting responses. I only have time to really go into one of them this evening. But let's dig into it. Which of these premises should we look at? Well, interestingly, you might think you could take issue with premise 1, and there might be an interesting discussion there about what exactly God owes to creatures. But here I'm going to suggest that we take a look at premise 2, this idea that there are in fact gratuitous evils in our world. How do we try to tackle that? Why might we think that it's false? There are two possible strategies here. One, you could try to do a direct denial and say of any particular evil that you experience in the world, no, actually, there is some greater good, and I'm going to show you what it is. I'm going to point it out right here. But what I want to suggest is that we're not really perfectly in a position, and in fact, it's often unhelpful for us to pretend as though we have the perfect answer to everything that's going on in every single evil that people undergo. Just as it turns out, we're not always in a position to know the full extent of what is going on or what's the cause, what's the explanation. We know from Scripture that there are all sorts of different explanations. In the book of Job, for example, we see that some sufferings are the result of demonic and angelic sort of interesting conflicts. We also know that, sometimes there's just not really a great answer that we can put our finger on and say like, oh, here it is, here's why, right here. So I would suggest instead of going that route, we consider this alternative possibility. It's called the Morean shift. And it's called the Morean shift for reasons that aren't totally relevant to us here, but here's how it works. Actually, what do I do here? Let's take a look. Yeah, okay, perfect. Here's an example of the Morean shift in action. This is an argument to the conclusion that there is, in fact, no gratuitous evil. How does it work? Premise 1 says, if God is all good and all powerful, then there will be no gratuitous evil. Premise 2 says, hey, guess what? God is all good and all powerful. Why might you think that? Well, for example, you might have an argument from contingency. That might give you evidence to think like, oh, I have good reasons to believe that there is a good and powerful God that exists. And if I accept both of these premises, then it entails that, in fact, although I may not have the answer, the perfect explanation for every single evil that I encounter, I have good evidence to trust that God is at work and that it's not over. These are these two arguments side by side. Notice how they relate to each other. Premise 1 of the two arguments is the same. They share this common conviction that an all-good, all-powerful God would not allow for gratuitous evils. One of them goes on to say, well, there are in fact gratuitous evils, so there's no God. The other says, there is in fact a God, so there are in fact no gratuitous evils. That God is at work in everything. The question that you have to ask for yourself is which of these claims is more plausible? And so that leads us to this core question that I wanted to raise for you. And it's this. Do your personal experiences, the testimony of other believers, the promises of Scripture, and the arguments for theism give you the confidence to trust that there is a God who, no matter what happens to you, to those you love, to those you don't know, that there's a God who's capable of redeeming all of it? This is all powerful and relevant and important evidence that could lead you to this. And if you accept this, then you've got what you need to accept the Morean shift argument. and say, you know, I may not have all the answers, but an interesting feature of our experience is that whether an event is truly tragic or is ultimately redeemable depends a lot on how the story ends. We can tell stories of two lives that look very similar for a while, of people who, for example, fall into drug addiction and abuse, and their stories seem tragic and hopeless. But if that situation is redeemed, if they recover, then it becomes this incredibly powerful story of victory and hope and redemption. And it recolors everything that happened before in light of this new, promising, optimistic hope. And what I would suggest is that as Christians, we know already what the end of the story is. That no matter how tragic what you go through in this life is, God is capable of making you new, is capable of redeeming it, is capable of making your story more beautiful than you could have ever possibly imagined. That there are hard times and difficulties, and we don't have to pretend that away. But the hope of the Christian, the trust of the Christian, is that no matter how bad it gets, God is bigger. That God can do it. He can bring it back. And so that's where I would suggest, that's the thing that I suggest we should keep in mind as Christians as we go through this life. That there are difficult times, but that this life is just not the end of the story. That there's a whole lot more to be said and done. And that at the end of it all, it's going to be wonderful. So, I think that's everything that I had here. A couple further resources for you if you're thinking about the problem of pain. One is C.S. Lewis's book on the subject. This is a more intellectual book. Another is by Nicholas Wolterstorff. It's called Lament for a Son. He's a very successful, very good theologian and philosopher who lost his own son tragically in a climbing accident. And this is just a book on his reflections on the experience. It's a very thoughtful, very serious engagement from a believer that doesn't pretend to have all the answers. And then also on YouTube, Mike Winger, he's really good on this stuff. So if you wanted to look him up and look up how to answer the problem of evil in 5 steps, that would be another good resource for you. That's all I have for now, so I don't know how we're doing on time. It looks like we still have around 20 minutes, technically, I think, correct? 7:30? So I want to throw this open to you all now. See, what are your thoughts? Do you have any questions? Is there anything that wasn't totally clear? Yes?
Thomas Aquinas originally proposed the two arguments, the cosmological argument, the first theory and then the contingency theory. But a lot of organizations have even taken this contingency and placed it for training in their leadership and how to respond to their employees as a leadership style and how to get through these things. So even though we tend to think, oh, it's just religion, it's just this, it's just that, or the other thing, it is an extremely important philosophy from Thomas Aquinas that they're starting to put into action into the organization.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know about that. So that's cool. Yeah, I find the argument from contingency, it just has a certain kind of plausibility, even just thinking about myself and just this, like, why am I here? Like, I don't have to exist. I don't have to be here. Why am I here at all? And just in that sort of reflection, you start this domino effect that leads to this interesting conclusion. And yes, Thomas Aquinas, yeah.
Does the first cause argument differ from the contingency argument?
Okay, yeah, I see. So the contingency argument, interestingly, so you talk about like the first cause, it's in the name, specifically an argument concerned with causality. You might have people who want to reject the first cause argument for various reasons. Just say things about like, oh no, I think that it's possible for there to be a circular, like an infinite causal sequence that's circular or something like that. The argument from contingency is not vulnerable to that type of objection because it's not talking exclusively about, like causality is a type of dependence, but contingency is broader than that. It has to do with all these different like compositional dependency. You might think about nomenological dependency, like I was mentioning just a moment ago. So it's this idea that the contingency argument, they both have value, and I think depending on where a person is coming from, for example, if someone's scientifically minded in certain kinds of ways, then they might find a more like a causal, a first cause type argument more appealing. But in certain ways, I think the argument from contingency doesn't get hung up on some of the problems that people might raise for the causal argument. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Great question. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Yeah, go for it. Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, I'm jumping the gun here. I'm a little new to this.
Check. Okay, there we go.
Sweet.
So I wanted to know on kind of the Morean shift. When I've discussed with people about the problem of evil, more the way I tend to go is that if God destroyed evil, he would destroy humanity. And it's more like trying to, remove a tumor, but you're going to kill the patient.
Sure.
Where does that sort of argument that it's actually God's love and mercy that keeps him from destroying evil because he would destroy us in the process, and so to avoid the whole destroying the village in order to save it fallacy.
Sure.
Where does that fit on that continuum?
Yeah. So I think this is a legitimate move, and some people may accept it. I think where you might run into difficulties is just this question. So interestingly, this could potentially get into some free will type stuff. Because depending on your view of free will, you might believe that a certain kind of understanding of what's called compatibilism is true, according to which it's possible for human beings to be free and for us to be causally determined by antecedent factors. And if someone believes compatibilism, then they might think that it's possible for God to have made us in such a way that we didn't fall into sin. And so if you thought like, a compatibilist picture of the world is possible, then you might resist this idea that human beings are necessarily so tightly entangled with evil that removing it from the situation would also remove us. So one advantage of dealing with people in this sort of, using the sort of Morean shift instead, is that, again, it's just a little bit broader in its scope. It's not saying you could, and I think we do have good evidences where we can give explanations, and I lean towards this sort of understanding that you're suggesting as well. I'm sympathetic with your sort of idea that, like, hey, if God decided to get rid of evil, guess who's going? Yeah, it's me, surprise. I'm sympathetic with that sort of idea, but one appeal of this sort of move is that you don't have to quite take on as much on board at the outset about what human nature consists in order to potentially get someone to buy into this argument, because you're not saying like, here's the specific reason that we have to have evil be involved. And also, I will just add an additional element or additional advantage of this particular argument is like when it comes to the argument from gratuitous evil, it's not just the existence of evil, but it's also the degrees and the amounts as we experience it. And so it's this sort of idea. Some people will grant for like, okay, sure, like I'll allow that like human beings are sinful, but did it have to be this bad or something like that? It's sort of this degreed element as well. And so again, I think your sort of response is viable, but it's just like, hey, this is a way of saying I'm going to sidestep that stuff, and I'm going to say, as a Christian, here's why I hold fast to my belief, my conviction, even in the face of evidences that, like, hey, I agree with you, this is a terrible atrocity, like this is horrible, and I don't always have a good answer in the moment for why this is happening, like this particular thing. So those would be my sort of initial thoughts, but I do think that there's space, and when we consider particular evils, I think there are times where we can say, like, no, this is very clearly tied into the corruption of human nature, the human heart, like this is on full display in this instance, and it's tied in with these other theological considerations, yeah.
So basically you're saying that the Morean shift is a little bit of philosophical jiu-jitsu in that it kind of flips their momentum. It's like, well, you're saying my argument is true because of this, but you're saying, okay, well, if your argument is true, then my argument is true.
So I think that's an interesting way of putting it. What I think is going, I'm not sure I totally fully, I like the phrase, I'm not sure I totally picture the image perfectly.
Using your opponent's momentum against them.
It is using their momentum against them in a way. I would say it's halting the momentum in that their argument crucially relies upon this premise. You have to accept that there is gratuitous evil. And you're saying, as the Christian, you're saying like, no, I don't accept, like, hey, I'm in perfect agreement with you on this idea that an all-good, all-powerful God isn't going to allow for gratuitous evil. I just deny this other thing. Like, in fact, I believe this God is there. And so any particular evil that I encounter, I believe ultimately God has a purpose and a plan in it. And I may not identify what it is. But yeah, so I think so, yes. Anybody else have something, maybe unclarity, or like we've had really good, really deep, thoughtful questions, but I'm also totally happy if someone's like, I just didn't get this part. Like, what was going on here? Like, that's fine too. Okay, I'll talk when we get home. Yeah, no worries. All right, well, okay, cool.
So I kind of got a question also regarding the good and evil, and I think this is kind of the hardest topic to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can go into free will and why does God allow bad things to happen, and so we can experience the good, and we can kind of separate, and then you can go into the disease and cancer issue. But when you argue why does God allow bad things to happen, we can say, well, he's given us the choice to choose him, and so we can experience joy and love. Well, how do you take that argument and say we go into heaven? Would that mean we no longer have free will?
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I like this thought. Here's my gut response on this. So I do believe that we have free will in this life. But I don't believe that we're able to exercise it as fully as we would like to. There's this beautiful passage in Romans 7 where Paul is talking about the struggle of the flesh. And he says, oh, wretched man that I am, I do the thing I don't want to do. I do the thing I hate. And we all experience this, I think. We all experience these moments in life where I want to be better than I am. My deepest desire is that I would do differently than what I in fact do. But because of my weaknesses in the here and now, I'm not able to be that. I'm not able to live that out. And so I would say, actually, I'm of the conviction that in the afterlife, on the other side, our free will is more fully maximized, and that in Christ we are given the power to live out the sort of freedom that we always meant to express, that we always had the desire. Like, there's this sort of, there are two different understandings of free will in the literature. One is called the alternative possibilities understanding of free will, according to which, in order to be free, I always have to be able to choose either option A or option B. I have this two-way power that I get to exercise. The other understanding of free will is what's known as the sourcehood notion, which says that my actions have to come from me, that I can't be compelled or something like that. And I think there's space when we think about heaven and the full scope of eternity for these two views to come together, where in my exercise, in my struggling, in my failing to live out my true nature as a redeemed, born-again Christian in this life, I failed to be the most free and true expression of who I am here and now. But then on the other side, I might be able to actually be more free in virtue of not falling victim to these temptations and everything that were considered expressions of free will and legitimate expressions of free will in this lifetime. But then because I've made this ultimate choice, a choice that overrides all others to follow Jesus, but I'm not able to live out that choice fully in this life, that in heaven I will be given the grace to actually live out the most important free will decision that I ever made. That's my response. I think it's a really, really good and interesting question, but that's the way that I would try to respond if I'm understanding the question. Feel free to push back if I've missed something for you here.
No, that makes sense.
Okay, cool, awesome. Yes. Hi. I think so, yeah.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Going all the way back to the beginning, when you were defining an argument for us. And so if I'm making an argument with a non-Christian, how do we argue? If we have different definitions of some of these things that we're discussing. Back in the 90s, I read a book by Dr. Ronald Nash, and he's good friends with Albert Matimba. And so they were talking about is that how sometimes they neologize, which was a word that Dr. Matimba coined. How do you deal with that? Because for me as a Christian, I want the Bible to define my words and my theology and arguments. So how do you handle that, especially if somebody's neologizing or co-opting your language? What would your approach be?
Yeah, awesome. My wife is going to be giving a talk on this on Sunday to the youth. But I think getting clear on the terms is a great place to start. I mean, just asking people. I think one of the main temptations or one of the main things to avoid, I feel like often when we enter into discussion with non-believers, we take on all this pressure and we're like, okay, this is it. This is all on me. I've got to win this argument. I've got to win. And I know that we know that that's not something that we should fall into, but the temptation is there. And so I would say just honestly pursuing truth and getting to know them and where they're coming from. Why is it, you use this word, what do you mean by that? Why do you use it that way? What's in the background here? And if, as they're unpacking what they mean by these particular terms, you come to realize, oh, here's this really important, crucial point at which I take issue with, or I disagree. This is where our worldviews really clash. You're coming at things from this point of view. I'm coming at things from this point of view. As you've unpacked what you mean by this, you're explaining certain commitments that you have that I just don't buy. And maybe you know right then, oh, here's why I don't buy them. Or you just say, I'm not I don't see things that way. Tell me a little bit more about why you think this, why are you sold on this? Why do you think this is true? And that can be a really fruitful, interesting discussion that often gets a little bit deeper to the core of where they're coming from, what they care about, where the stakes of the arguments are for them. I think all of those things are really valuable. And it's the mutual pursuit of truth. It's the engagement. It's the taking the other person seriously as a thoughtful human being who has a bunch of experiences behind why they see the world the way that they do, and hearing their story that I think is really valuable. So I don't know if there was more that you wanted to get at than that, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is just that totally happens all the time. Even my wife and I can just be having a conversation, not at all loaded or anything, and just realize, oh, actually we were using words really differently from each other, and we were totally talking past it. It happens without you even realizing it all the time, but once you do realize it, start talking about it. I think that's my answer there.
How do you get to own the definition, especially as a Christian, and you are your own? Oh, I don't have it.
What would be a technique, or how would you ensure the quality of the argument that we're keeping it biblically defined? I'm sorry,
Yeah, so I see what you're getting at now. I mean, I don't know that you can, what I said in debate, say that you ask where from that of you, and you get to explain, yeah, here's how my worldview fits together. And maybe in the process of explaining that, you can say, here's some of these really beautiful perks of Christianity that here's some things that come together with my worldview, with my understanding of these terms, some of the value that I see in thinking of the world and seeing it through this lens. G.K. Chesterton has this great line, I think it's in Mere Orthodoxy, I'm not sure, where he talks about, he's like, Christianity, you have so many different worldviews that they cater to one extreme or the other. They talk about it's all about totalitarian power, or it's all about just the individual, radical individualism or radical community or something like that. All of these extremes. And Christianity is this particular interesting view that you find in the middle of everything that's got its fist just absolutely clenched on one extreme and absolutely clenched on the other and says, I refuse to give up either. all of this matters, all of this is important, and I'm going to retain both. And we see that even in mysteries like the Trinity, where you have from the very beginning, you have individuals and you have community working together in perfect harmony, and it's mysterious to us, but it's just this uncompromising commitment that Christianity has that we see when you give up on it and you drift towards these extremes, you end up with self-destructive, or you end up with a worldview often that eats itself, that undermines itself in all these different ways. So my leaning there would be just like, be willing to, the same sort of questioning that you would put the other person through, let them put you through that too, and show that your case wins the day. That would be probably, as far as my gut on how to retain or how to hold fast to the definitions, that would be my leaning on how to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe
Yeah.
one more for you.
Yeah.
When you think about the origin of sin, do you treat that the same way you do the problem of evil?
Say a little bit more for me so I can
The
understand.
question that I get a lot from some of my non-Christian friends is, where did sin come from? Right? So if everything was perfect, how was sin allowed to creep in?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So I do lean on that particular case. Like, I think you could apply something similar here of like, okay, maybe we don't know all of the full specifics of the metaphysical backstory of it, but I do think that there's space there for free will to be an explanation. I actually do lean towards the free will sort of response in that sort of case and say, like, yeah, there could be a, maybe now, in the hindsight, post-fall, there's corruption and proclivities that we all have to deal with that predispose us towards sin from the very outset, that we do have the sin nature. I don't think you need to posit that with Adam and Eve, but you can still say, like, hey, they had free will. I think that seems to me like an adequate explanation. I'm curious, do you have different thoughts, or how do you typically tend to respond on it?
Good question. I don't have a great response for it.
Sure. No, yeah. I think free will works in that case, and maybe someone would disagree, and I would be really curious to hear like some of the pushback on. But it seems to me like you could have a neutral state, or like you could have Adam and Eve without a predisposition to fall, but that they could choose nonetheless, given that they have this free will in the two-way power sort of sense, that they could choose to actualize it in a sinful sort of way, and then you get the domino effect of everything. Like, it seems to me like that's an option. There are really tricky questions here, and I do understand that. So I tread lightly on this stuff and hold it with an open hand. But I do think that there are plausible answers that we can give, where it's not just a throw your hands up in the air sort of a thing.
Great, thanks. Say that again. He said God never said he made everything perfect.
Yeah, and there are people who go that sort of direction and say, like, okay, what does it actually mean for everything to be made good? Maybe just like it's what God wanted it to be, or something like that. So there is space, I think, there that you could take that sort of a route too. But I think this is a space where there's just a lot of room for reasonable disagreement among Christians. Definitely not a space to break fellowship over, but a space where you can share with someone who's seriously disagree or like seriously hung up on it. Okay, let's wrestle with this together. Let's think about it. Come to a conclusion that like I'm at peace with, I can accept, and share like, okay, this was a good enough answer for me, and that's okay. Like this is one of those spaces where there's not a creedal sort of definitive declaration of like, hey, here's the view, here's what it means to be an Orthodox Christian when it comes to the specific origins of original sin. There's some room for freedom of disagreement and continued fellowship in the midst of things that we'll find out on the other side. That's kind of my like initial sort of leaning. But
Great, thank you.
Yes.
You don't have to consider the background of that individual in your decision on how to respond to it.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these things, like you want to have these conversations in relationship as much as you can. It's more valuable to be talking to someone that you know. They're a lot more likely to listen to you after if you know the sort of information about where they're coming from, where these particular hangups are for them. If this is really the core issue for them, or if there's something else in the background that's doing work, I think yes, that's absolutely something to be considered here for sure. Cool. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. I'm going to go ahead and say a prayer for us. I want to say thank you so much, everybody. I really enjoyed my time with you this evening, and thank you. All right, let's pray. Father God, I thank you so much for this time that I get to just come and hang out and talk with fellow believers and pursue truth. And there are so many big questions that we don't have all the perfect answers for in this life. But Lord, we know you and we trust you. We know that you're good. We know that you're at work. And in those moments where we don't have all the perfect answers, we lean into that. But nonetheless, we just rejoice that you are the God of all truth and that you go before us in these things, that we don't have to live in fear about what the next scientific discovery is going to be, whether someone's going to write a book that's going to show that all of our conviction, all of our practices, all of our belief, all of our hope are lies, that we can rest safely in you. And we're grateful for that, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.